Hello everyone, this is John Burness talking to you all again, and I am just here to do a unofficial video edition of another episode of my web series Why Sound Poetry, in which I provide in-depth analysis and academic details as to why sound poetry should be, I guess, taken more seriously from an artistic standpoint and an intellectual standpoint. And I noticed something pretty eye-opening a couple days ago, kind of like a revelation almost, which is most of my body of work, and the reason I'm doing this is actually not so much to convince people to love poetry, but it's much more to convince people to not hate poetry. A lot of places I go, I still see poetry in the media, TV shows, and especially in academic circles, which is pretty bewildering. People trashing on it and saying that it's an illegitimate form of art, it's an effeminate form of art, and that it has, I guess it doesn't occur to people that it can have really great philosophical insight and healing powers and other psychoanalytical powers. But anyway, never mind. So I want to read an article written by a translator, Jill Alexander Essbaum, about the really wonderful 20th century sound poet Elsa Von Freytag Loringhoven, who is the reason I started doing sound poetry. I get inspired every time I read about her life story and her writings, and right in front of me I have a copy of her book, Body Sweats, her collections of writings and poetry, which if you're even remotely interested in sound poetry or any experimental poetry or modern poetry, I cannot recommend this enough. Buy it, please do. If you ever see this anywhere at a used bookstore, do yourself a favor and not leave the store without it. Please buy it. It is expensive, but what's even more expensive is spending your life never knowing about this stuff. So I can't recommend this enough. It's one of my most prized possessions. And unfortunately, due to the fact that it's out of print and pretty high production, it's on the more expensive side. But I'm very glad that I own it. So Elsa Von Freytag Loringhoven was the reason I started doing sound poetry. I even wrote a poem about it that you can find online called The Future Belongs to Elsa, in which none other than Marcel Duchamp said this about her. He said, Elsa Von Freytag, she is not a futurist. She is the future. And that's always stuck with me, and then this opportunity opened up of this really obscure form of art that nobody knows about, and I feel like it's kind of my responsibility to bring it to the masses. So that's kind of a little bit of a backstory as to why I'm doing all this. And I love reading about translators and their process of translating works. In fact, if you know what I'm up to, I've been doing translations myself. And I never would have imagined I'd be doing translations. I never would have thought that if being a music-obsessed gimp when I was 17 and 18, I would have never imagined that 5 years, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, at 23 now, that the majority of the people I'd be collaborating with would be translators and linguists. So I never would have imagined I would have valued translators so much in society. But I feel that this is a very important article to read aloud to you all. It could hopefully shine a little bit of insight, and it did for me. It's an absolutely beautiful article on Jill Alexander Essbaum's process to translating one of Elsa's poems. In English, it's titled Fruit Don't Fall Far. I will paste the link to this article below for you to read it, but just for canonical reasons, I feel important for me to read it aloud to you all. So this is a really wonderful, beautiful article, and I really apologize for the really loud buzzing noise, humming noise. My MSI fan is really acting up, and it's super annoying. But the show must go on, as both amazing rock bands, Queen and Pink Floyd, have written about. Anyhow, so I'm going to read this article. It's the translator's note. The actual work, the actual poem, is really beautiful as well, but I feel the translator's note is more insightful as to what sound poetry actually is and what experimental poetry altogether really is. So here's how it says. This was published on June 1st, 2011, and by Jill Alexander Essbaum. Because I am hardly a Dada aficionada, I was entirely unaware that such a creature as Baroness Elsa Von Freytag Loringhoven existed until I heard the writer Renee Steinke read from her novel Holy Skirts, a National Book Award finalist based on the Baroness's eccentric and compelling life. Since then, I've learned simply this: nothing of the Baroness isn't fascinating. I was pointed to this poem by Irene Jamel, a Dada and modernism scholar, as well as the editor of the forthcoming book, Body Sweats. Body Sweats, the uncensored writings of Elsa Von Freytag Loringhoven. I was drawn particularly to this poem because it is, at least in its form, decidedly un-Dada. It more closely matches my own aesthetical preferences than do many of the Baroness's other poems. Gamel's translation of an alternate draft of this poem was published in a 2003 issue of the Literary Review. My rendition of Zuhör, which is German for empty, is more interpretive than faithful to its source. For example, the Baroness's poem is 19 lines of varying meter. I have translated it as a strict sonnet, lopping off a few images in the process. 2, my version is coarser than the first, while this stylistic decision perhaps led me further away from Elsa's poem. It was a choice that brought me nearer to Elsa herself, icon of bawdy irreverence that she was. And that's definitely a compliment. I take my title from the poem's Gamel translated variant draft, Analytische der Frucht, interpreted by Gamel as Analytical Chemistry of Progeny. My title veers widely. Zuhör vaguely translates as tada or hurrah, or any number of exclamations difficult to render. And that's a lot of what sound poetry is making entire works of exclamations rather than words, of what's in between the words rather than the words. And indeed, that is sort of the universal consequence of sound poetry, is they are very difficult to render at a linguistic level. They're very difficult to write down. They're very difficult to record in audio, but especially write down. They're very difficult to use in any interpretive language, and that's the most common consequence of sound poetry, and it's entirely on purpose. And that's why with my work of sound poetry, I like to use a lot of normal words, just so it's not such a vast jump for the majority of people to go from poetry to sound poetry. So I'm here, I guess I like to make that jump a little smoother, more like walking downstairs than taking a giant leap, because that is one of the things that turns people off about it, and I don't want people to be turned off by sound poetry. So, anyway, the first 2 lines, my version collapses into one, are my favorites, and I'm going to read this in German and then in English. Der Heimswasswatter ist mir angeboren, von meinem Papa ich ihn gehabt, which means, in English, for years I pleaded my own case to parents, pastors, and exceptionally prudish friends. Not only is this the perfect comeback, hereafter it shall be my only comeback. Danke, Baroness Jai. So, I don't want to hear this humming anymore. There. So yeah, that was the beautiful article written by Elsa Von Freytag Loringhoven's Translator that I thought was very necessary, because a lot of my body of work and a lot of my life right now is to make sound poetry more popular and just more respectable. And like I said earlier, it's not, I guess it's actually not so much to give it a positive reputation or connotation as to diminish a negative connotation to it, to not make it so inaccessible and pretentious. And that's another really big complaint people have about poetry. And that's another big reason why I found it highly important to broadcast myself reading that article. Because one of my favorite things to read about, and I think one of the most important things we have to do in the 21st century, is explain our work in depth. I know a lot of philosophers have heavily spoken against that, Wittgenstein being one of them, and Pushkin being the other. That's, I think, the death of experimental art, is when we don't leave the general public with an explanation as to what inspired us to create this work. What are we trying to communicate with this work, and what does it mean for us, and what could it mean to you? The fact that we have not been doing that, especially with more underground music and underground art, people are starting to sort of interpret it, and I don't blame them, as being inaccessible and therefore pretentious and therefore out of touch. And I guess I'm here to diminish that, and that's why I do love to explain. And I think not only that, I feel obliged. I think it's important to explain the process of my work, and here's someone coming from a similar angle as me, and I just read aloud their inspiration and their process to their work. And I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. Again, I apologize for the highly annoying MSI fan overload that I have going on there. And again, I want to show you this book, and I cannot recommend it enough. If you are into any form of weird poetry or modern poetry, this will be a massive gift at the end of your life, at the end of the road. It's too intense. But anyway, I sincerely hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you're having a beautiful day or beautiful night wherever you are. And as they say in Hawaiian, meka mahalo, that means with gratitude.